Imagine that at this very moment, someone may be controlling parts of your life without raising their voice, without appearing dominant or threatening. Quite the opposite. This person seems fragile, sensitive, insecure, maybe even like a victim. And that is exactly why they are able to manipulate you. Most people believe in a dangerous lie, that manipulation comes from strong, dominant, authoritarian individuals. But in reality, many of the most effective manipulators are precisely the weakest ones. Not physically weak, psychologically fragile. People who don't possess real power and therefore learn to control others through guilt, drama, victimhood, and emotional pressure. They don't impose, they drain. And the most disturbing part is that many times you only realize it when you're already deeply trapped in their game. Nietzsche had a brutal observation about human nature. When someone doesn't have enough strength to dominate directly, they learn to dominate indirectly. He called this the morality of the weak. It isn't about kindness, it's about strategy, and a very ancient strategy. Throughout history, there have always been two types of power: direct power and psychological power. The first uses authority, status, money, and influence. The second uses something much more subtle. It uses the human mind against itself. And here is something very few people realize. The human brain is extremely vulnerable to emotional manipulation, far more than we like to admit. Because our brain did not evolve to seek truth. It evolved to avoid social pain, rejection, conflict, guilt, shame. These emotions activate brain regions very similar to those involved in physical pain. In other words, being rejected by the group can activate the brain almost like a physical attack. Weak manipulators discovered this intuitively. They realized they don't need to defeat you in a confrontation. They only need to trigger certain emotions: guilt, responsibility, fear of appearing like a bad person. And then something curious happens. You begin to obey without realizing that you're obeying. To fully understand this, we need to talk about a psychological mechanism described by Carl Jung: the shadow. According to Jung, every human being has an unconscious part where impulses we don't want to acknowledge are stored. Anger, selfishness, the desire for power, competitiveness. These parts are repressed because we were taught they are wrong. So we create an identity based on the opposite: kindness, generosity, empathy. But here's the problem. When someone learns to manipulate those values, they gain enormous control over you. Strong people manipulate through threats. Weak people manipulate through your conscience. They make you feel that you need to help them, that you need to compensate for something, that you need to prove you are a good person, and that creates an invisible prison. Because now, you don't obey out of fear. You obey to protect your own moral identity. This kind of manipulation appears everywhere: in relationships, in families, at work, and on social media. How many times have you seen someone use suffering as a tool of influence? Someone who constantly places themselves as the victim. Someone who turns any disagreement into a personal attack. Someone who creates an atmosphere where questioning them makes you look cruel. This is one of the oldest psychological games in human history. The game of strategic fragility. But there is something even more disturbing. Weak manipulators often don't do this consciously. They genuinely believe they are victims, and that makes the manipulation even more powerful. Because when someone manipulates consciously, there is strategy. When they manipulate unconsciously, there is conviction, and emotional conviction is extremely persuasive. Machiavelli observed something similar about human nature. Most people don't manipulate out of pure malice. They manipulate because they feel small, threatened, out of control. And when someone feels they have no direct power, they begin to develop indirect tools: emotional blackmail, victimhood, guilt induction, passive aggression, punishing silence. And here a very uncomfortable question emerges. Have you ever noticed how some people can make you feel guilty, even when you did nothing wrong? This happens through a mechanism called reversed emotional responsibility. It occurs when someone transfers the responsibility for their feelings onto you. For example, I felt really hurt by what you did. So far, that seems normal. But manipulators take it a step further. If you really cared about me, you wouldn't have done that. Now the conversation is no longer about facts. It's about morality, about who you are as a person. And in that moment, most people retreat. Because our brain has a deep fear of appearing morally wrong. This activates something called identity threat. When our moral identity is questioned, we enter defensive mode. We try to explain, to justify, to compensate, and very often, to give in. Weak manipulators understand this intuitively. They don't need to win the argument. They only need to make you feel like a bad person. And then you correct yourself. Without realizing you were pushed in that direction. There is also a more sophisticated level of this game. The game of strategic incompetence. It's the manipulator who always seems incapable, always lost, always overwhelmed, always needing help. At first, you feel empathy. You help. You guide. You solve problems. But slowly, something begins to happen. The responsibility for that person's life starts to fall on you. They depend on you for decisions, for emotional stability, for solving crises. And if you try to step away, they collapse emotionally. They say they can't handle things alone. And once again, the most powerful psychological trigger appears: guilt. Because leaving the situation makes you look cruel, selfish, like someone who abandons vulnerable people. But there is a difficult truth to accept. Many of these dynamics are not genuine weakness. They are learned dependency. The brain quickly learns which behaviors generate social support. If showing incapacity generates help, that behavior begins to repeat itself. Over time, it becomes identity. The person starts to see themselves as someone who needs to be saved. Jung used to say that what we fail to make conscious governs our lives, and weak manipulators live exactly in that territory. They don't say, "Control my life." They say something far more powerful: "I can't live without you." This activates deep instincts in the human mind: protection, care, responsibility. But there is a hidden cost. The more you assume the role of the savior, the less space remains for your own freedom. And this is where manipulation becomes most dangerous, when you no longer realize that you are being manipulated. because now you believe you're simply being a good person, helping, being loyal, being responsible, and in a way, you are. But at the same time, your energy is being slowly drained. Your decisions begin to revolve around someone else's emotional state. You avoid conflict. You avoid saying no. You avoid setting boundaries. Because any boundary generates drama. And weak manipulators are specialists at turning boundaries into personal attacks. For them, a simple no becomes proof of abandonment, proof of indifference, proof of selfishness. But there is something even deeper in this game. Weak manipulators don't manipulate only individuals. They influence collective morality. When that happens, the dynamic stops being personal. It becomes cultural. Nietzsche called this the inversion of values. When groups without direct power organize themselves, they create moral systems that favor their position. Values like extreme sacrifice, moral submission, guilt for desiring autonomy. These values appear virtuous, but often they function as mechanisms of social control. Because when someone believes that setting boundaries is cruelty, that person becomes extremely easy to manipulate. And this dynamic is becoming increasingly present in the modern world, especially on social media. There, moral status has become a powerful currency. People compete for moral authority, for emotional validation, for recognition as victims or saviors. And in this environment, weak manipulators thrive because they master a specific skill, turning emotions into influence, creating emotional narratives, mobilizing collective empathy, turning criticism into persecution, turning disagreement into attack. But there is one crucial detail. In many cases, the weak manipulator is not the most vulnerable person in the dynamic. The most vulnerable person is the one who needs to feel necessary, the one who needs to save, the one who needs to be emotionally responsible for others. Because that need opens a massive door for manipulation. And this is where the situation becomes even more complex. Weak manipulators don't create these relationships alone. These relationships are born from the meeting of two psychological forces. On one side, the need to be saved. On the other, the need to save. When these two forces meet, one of the hardest relationships to break in human psychology emerges. But what almost no one realizes is that this dynamic hides an even deeper mechanism. A mechanism that makes intelligent, strong, and independent people end up trapped in exactly this kind of manipulation. And when you understand this mechanism, you realize something disturbing. Perhaps the biggest mistake people make when trying to avoid weak manipulators is precisely the trait they are most proud of. And this is exactly where the story starts to become truly dangerous. There is a very common belief among intelligent people. A quiet belief, almost invisible. The idea that intelligence protects you from manipulation. But psychological reality shows the opposite. Reflective, empathetic, and morally responsible people are often the most vulnerable to weak manipulators. And this happens for a simple reason. These people think too much. They analyze, they try to understand others, and they constantly question themselves. Was I unfair? Did I overreact? Should I have been more empathetic? Now imagine what happens when a mind like this meets someone who knows how to trigger guilt and emotional fragility. The empathetic person enters an endless cycle of self-reflection. While they analyze, the manipulator controls the dynamic. This happens because weak manipulators don't play the game of logic. They play the game of emotion. Rational debates can end. Emotional conflicts rarely do. There is always one more interpretation, one more justification, and this creates the perfect environment for manipulation. Socrates once said, "The greatest human mistake is believing we know what is truly good." This sentence reveals something profound. Weak manipulators often present themselves as representatives of goodness. They are not controlling you, they are protecting feelings. They are not creating emotional pressure. They are expressing pain. They are not imposing dependency. They simply need support. These narratives create a moral shield. Questioning the manipulator starts to feel like questioning someone's suffering. And very few people have the psychological courage to do that, because we have been conditioned to automatically respond to the suffering of others. This is part of our biological system. There is a circuit in the brain known as the empathy system, involving regions such as the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula. These areas activate when we see someone suffering. In simple terms, our brain reacts to suffering as a social emergency signal, and weak manipulators exploit this system precisely. They turn emotions into constant alarms: sadness, disappointment, fragility. These emotions create psychological pressure in the environment, and slowly the people around them begin to adjust their behavior to avoid triggering those alarms. This process is almost invisible, but it completely changes the power dynamic. The manipulator doesn't need to impose rules. People begin to censor themselves, avoid certain topics, avoid disagreeing, avoid setting boundaries, because any boundary might trigger an intense emotional reaction. And then something curious happens. The most fragile person in the group begins to control everyone's behavior. This phenomenon appears in families, friendships, companies, and communities. Some psychologists call this emotional dictatorship. There is no formal authority, but there is one person whose emotional instability governs the environment. Everyone walks around them as if they were in a minefield. This creates a fascinating paradox. The person who appears weakest becomes the most powerful. Friedrich Nietzsche observed something similar when he spoke about resentment. According to him, when someone feels they lack the strength to act directly, they begin to act indirectly. They criticize those who are strong. They condemn those who set boundaries. They transform strength into selfishness, autonomy into coldness, independence into arrogance. This process slowly changes the meaning of things. The person who sets boundaries appears cruel. The person who seeks autonomy appears selfish. The person who refuses the drama appears insensitive. And when these values dominate an environment, weak manipulators thrive. But there is an even deeper layer. Carl Jung believed that many human dynamics are guided by archetypes, and one of them appears frequently in emotionally manipulative relationships. the savior archetype. There is a narrative repeated throughout human history. Someone suffers, someone needs to be saved, and someone steps into that role, the hero. This archetype is seductive. It gives purpose and identity, but it also creates a trap. Because if your identity is built on saving people, you need people who need saving. And this is exactly where weak manipulators enter. They offer the role of the victim. And when the savior meets the victim, a very stable relationship emerges, but not a healthy one. Both reinforce each other's role. The victim continues being a victim. The savior continues saving. And nobody grows. Because growth requires responsibility. If the victim takes responsibility, the savior loses their role. If the savior sets boundaries, the victim loses control. That's why these relationships can last for years. They are not sustained only by manipulation. They are sustained by identity. And eventually, a disturbing realization appears. Maybe the person is not only being manipulated. Maybe part of them is also participating in the dynamic. Not every manipulation is unilateral. Sometimes it is a system. A system where two psychological needs feed each other. But there comes a moment when this system begins to collapse. The person who always helped starts to feel something different. Exhaustion, irritation, frustration, a feeling that the relationship is not balanced. And then the first boundary appears. Maybe something small, a simple no. But for weak manipulators, boundaries are threats because they break the system. They remove automatic access to someone else's emotional energy. And then the most intense reaction appears: emotional escalation. The manipulator may become even more fragile or completely change strategy. They may accuse, they may blame, they may rewrite the story, they may turn you into the villain. This process is known in modern psychology as narrative inversion. Suddenly, the person who helped becomes the one who abandoned. The person who set boundaries becomes cruel. The person who sought autonomy becomes selfish. This is the final weapon of weak manipulation, the manipulation of moral reputation. Human beings are deeply sensitive to social opinion. For thousands of years, being rejected by the group meant survival risk. That instinct still exists. That's why moral accusations are so powerful. But here is the truth that changes everything. Psychological freedom requires something difficult: the ability to tolerate moral discomfort, to be misunderstood, to not always be seen as the hero. This does not mean losing empathy. It means reclaiming emotional responsibility. Each person is responsible for their own emotions. Helping someone is noble. But living another person's emotional life is not compassion. It is a prison. And when you understand this, something changes. You begin to notice patterns that were once invisible. When someone uses suffering as a tool, when they turn boundaries into attacks, when they need you to feel guilty. And in that moment, something powerful happens. You recover something manipulators always try to control: your psychological space, your ability to decide, your ability to say no. And interestingly, When this happens, some people simply disappear from your life because they never wanted you. They wanted access to your energy, and when that access disappears, the game stops being interesting. And this reveals one of the most liberating truths in human psychology. People who truly respect you do not need you to feel guilty to stay in your life. Now, I want to ask you something. While you were watching this video, did someone come to your mind? A relationship that always felt confusing or draining? If that happened, write the word awareness in the comments. And if you want to keep exploring the deeper layers of human psychology, philosophy, and behavior, subscribe now to the channel Art of Awareness, because in the next videos we're going to dive even deeper into the invisible forces that shape relationships and power. And sometimes, what looks like weakness is simply a form of power you haven't learned to recognize yet.